Hello and welcome back to Cosmic Nebula. So this is my first video of 2024, and in today's video I wanted to talk about how much people hate the fact that they were born into some kind of privilege. In today's video it will just be me talking, so you can set this video to play and go and do something else. As you can see, today I'm back in my costume, and so the reason that I decided to record this video is because of a thread that I saw on a subreddit. And that subreddit is a Millennials subreddit on Reddit. And that subreddit was essentially about how people deny how much of their success, right, in life, essentially propelled on by the fact that they were born with either rich parents or some kind of privilege that got them to that point in their lives. And I went through the comments, and I was just scrolling down the comments, and a lot of the comments were essentially, a lot of millennials are upset that they don't have the lifestyle that they want because they didn't choose the right college major and they didn't choose the right job. And so they try to blame society for their failures as an individual, basically, right? That's the general sentiment for a lot of the comments was that it's your fault that your life turned out the way that it did because your successes and failures are basically your actions alone, essentially. And so as I was reading through that comment thread, I just thought to myself, like, it amazes me how unaware people are of the fact that a large part of where they are in life is made by the fact that they were born in the right place, right? Of course, we all work hard to some degree, but no matter how hard you work, sometimes being in the right place at the right time or being born into the right circumstance matters, right? And so I wanted to talk about that today in this video. Originally, I actually made a response to that comment, but for some reason, I couldn't post on that goddamn subreddit. Like, this is something I dislike about Reddit, is how so many of the subreddits have all of these weird hoops you have to jump through in order to make fucking basic comments or posts. Like, your karma has to be a certain amount. You have to be on a website a certain amount. This account has to be that. All of these fucking rules. So I was like, you know what? I'm just going to make a YouTube video instead. And so my response to that concept was this. I think that a lot of people resent the fact that their privileges that they didn't necessarily ask for are the reasons why they are where they are in their lives. I really believe that. And I say that as a person who has come from a terrible background and that has had almost none of the standard privileges that a lot of people watching this video had in their lives. And so I wanted to talk about that. And I wanted to talk about just a general lack of empathy that people have for other people's experience, right? And this certain degree of naivete that a lot of people have. And that naivete, in my opinion, is also a privilege, right? Because you are so sheltered from the realities of other people's lives that you don't realize that the way that you grew up was actually a privilege. So let's start in the beginning. I wanted to talk about what privilege is. So when we say the word privilege, I think that people, especially first world Westerners, right? I was born in a first world country. I'm American. If you are listening to this, you are most likely born in a first world country, right? A lot of people born in first world countries have a different idea of what privilege is based off a person born in a third world country, for example, right? Privilege is extremely subjective from person to person. So if you were born working class, you would probably see privilege as being having extras, right? Most working class people, they are usually paycheck to paycheck. They have enough to sustain life, but they don't have money to go on vacations every year, to take their kids to Disneyland, to buy nice clothes or nice shoes, to buy their kids new cars, to have extra money in the bank, right? They don't have that extra income. They don't have that extra disposable income to use on themselves or their kids, right? To further improve their lives. But for the most part, a lot of working class people have the basic necessities, right? And then when you look at privilege from the point of view of a person who's middle class, well, they see privilege as having access to luxuries, right? Like luxury vacations, really expensive vacations to exotic places, the ability to buy really expensive luxury brands, cars, you know, Chanel, Gucci, stuff like that, Ferraris, Bentleys, right? They see the upper classes as being privileged, right? Not themselves, because they're only middle class. So because they have a decent amount of disposable income and they also have enough to support their bare necessities, but they don't have enough to be extravagant, they don't see themselves as privileged, right? And then it goes up from there, right? Upper middle class person or upper class person might see a person in the 5% as being more privileged than them, right? So the idea of privilege is extremely subjective. And I think that that is a big part of the problem, is that people allow privilege to be such a broad range of things, right? And I'm not saying that it necessarily has to be black and white, but I think that to some degree, us all being a part of a first world country, people forget that a lot of things that we see as basic rights or bare necessity is a massive privilege to somebody born in another country. So I want to talk a little bit about my own background, because I feel like you can't talk about this type of topic without talking about where you come from, right? I know a lot of people, they like to gloss over things whenever privilege is brought up. So I was born in the United States, and I was born in the Midwest, and I was born to the quintessential black, low income, single mother raising multiple kids. Have you ever seen the show called The Wire? I was born in a similar circumstance to that, but maybe a step and a half up. And the reason I say that is because I was born in a city, but I was not born in a huge metropolitan city like Baltimore, right? And so a metropolitan city has its own problems being as big as it is, right? But essentially, I was born like that. My mother graduated high school. She had multiple kids by the time she was 21, 22. My mother was a welfare queen. She didn't have a job for most of my childhood. I don't exactly know why, right? It was just normalized that she just didn't have a job. We got food stamps. We got, I think it's Medicaid, Medicare, my entire childhood. My father was a narcissist. And when I say narcissist, I recognize that narcissism and narcissist is a very overused term these days. But I mean, textbook narcissist, right? Because my paternal grandmother, his mother, is also a narcissist. And he never took care of us our entire lives. And then I don't remember when it started, but my mother also became a drug addict. She used to smoke crack, which is very popular in the black community. I think in the 70s, 80s, 90s, right? Until now. We essentially live the lifestyle that comes along with that, right? I mean, I feel like we go into detail. We can be here forever talking about it. But if you've seen a show like The Wire or any kind of show that shows inner city kind of poverty, drug addicted parents, and the type of environment kids have to be raised in, that's the type of environment I was raised in. And I know that shows like The Wire are really popular, but a lot of people don't recognize that The Wire wasn't a lie, right? And they don't recognize that a lot of kids grow up in that type of circumstance. And they don't recognize clearly what that means, right? Because you can see something and on an intellectual level, you can understand it. But a lot of life has to be experienced for you to truly know what something is, right? So I know what it feels like to be hungry. I know what it feels like to never have food in the house. I remember when I was a kid, we used to go to like food pantries on like a regular rotation, right? And I remember that there used to be churches and they would have like meal services, and we would all pile into the car and we would go to these meal services multiple times a week. And this went on for years and years and years and years and years. Like, I just remember there never being enough of anything in the house ever, right? Utilities getting cut off, gas being turned off, water being turned off, electricity being turned off, not having enough food in the house, getting evicted every year or 2 or 6 months or 9 months, right? Just this chaos constantly for 18 years. And, you know, people hear stuff like that and they'll say, well, wow, you did a great job overcoming that. But to some end, it's extremely patronizing. And so I wanted to talk about privilege from the point of view of a person who has never had, I want to say, much privilege. So let's go back to the idea of privilege, right? Like I said, for a lot of people, privilege is very relative. But I remember being in college, and I remember we took a psychology class where there was this concept of a pyramid of self-actualization. And essentially, it is a pyramid in which it gives you different stages of needs that a person has in order to reach their full potential. And I remember at the bottom of that pyramid, there was things like food, shelter, safety, love, support, et cetera, et cetera. And then once you had that part, then you went up a level to the non-survival necessities, right? We can't survive without water and food and shelter, right? It's impossible. So once that is satisfied, then you went up a level to other things. You went up a level to other things. And at the top of that pyramid was essentially, as long as all of these things are provided for you, actualizing and becoming the person that you were always meant to be is essentially is easier, right? I think that pyramid is a good example of what privilege is, in my opinion. So from the point of view of a person who has not had essentially any of barely the necessities at the bottom of that pyramid for 18 years, I look at my life and I realize how not having that has negatively impacted the trajectory of my entire life. And so then what is privilege, right? So in my opinion, privilege as a human being on earth is having access consistently through your entire childhood, having access to all your bare necessities. So your food, your water, and shelter. And I'm not talking about extras. I'm not talking about luxury. I'm not talking about nice. I'm not talking about high quality. I'm talking about consistent and stable access to all of those things for the majority of your childhood. And I know that this concept applies a lot to a lot of working class people. A lot of working class people or kids raised working class, they will work really hard to kind of push this idea that because they didn't have a middle class life, that they had a hard life. But from my point of view, people underestimate greatly what it feels like to have stability in your life, because I was raised in complete and utter chaos, which is why as an adult now, I absolutely don't I stay away from other people. And I mean that in every sense of the word. I spend most of my time alone because I associate relationships with other people as bringing chaos into my life. Like, I don't need it. I don't need your drama. Like, I feel like I've had enough drama to last me for the rest of my life, right? I don't need more. And so a lot of things that happen to other people that are just everyday occurrences, everyday hiccups, everyday ups and downs, just the flow of life. For me, I feel like I don't want to be a part of those things happening to you just because I've had just so much chaos for the first 18 years of my life that it's like I need a 60-year break from it, essentially, right? So this is a form of PTSD. This is a form of PTSD. And so if you've had those bare necessities met, and then on top of that, you have had one parent who loves you and who is sane and who has a job and who works hard to support you. I'm not saying that this person has to be perfect, right? But having that, again, consistently for the majority of your childhood, whether it was your mother, your father, both, a grandparent, an aunt, anybody who consistently provided love and support and attention to you consistently throughout your life is a privilege. People really have to understand that. I see a lot of times people say things like, I've been through a lot of hard stuff, and they'll try to say stuff like, I remember my parents got divorced when I was so-and-so age and it really affected me. And I think that I'm not going to say it doesn't negatively affect you, but again, if your parents provided the bare necessity and on top of that, they provided love and support and consistently, right? And I'm not saying to the degree of perfection because everybody has ups and downs in life. That's how it works, right? But I think that a lot of people see their little, a lot of people see these single events of trauma or difficulty in their lives and they kind of extrapolate it out to kind of be on the level of people who grew up like me, who had just, when I say 18 years of chaos and just trauma and neglect, I mean it in every sense, right? I really do. And I feel like unless you grew up where I grew up, you cannot conceive what that was like. And so when you had those things met, regardless of your social status, you grew up privileged from my point of view. And I think that a lot of people really resent the idea that they were raised with some kind of privilege because they feel like it means that they didn't have to work that hard to get where they are. And that's a fact, right? If you were born upper class and when your parents are upper class and they have careers, not just jobs, and they are college educated and they raised you in a nice community surrounded by a lot of other nice people who are also college educated, and they sent you to good schools and they provided everything you needed consistently for 18 years, and they gave you guidance in your career and in your major, and they paid for your college, or they contributed to your college, or they at least contributed emotional support to you. These are all privileges, right? And all of these things will have greatly impacted your life. And I remember in that subreddit post, a person said stuff like, well, you just didn't major in the right major and that's your fault and blah, blah, blah. And that really took me aback, because what 15, 16, 17, 18-year-old is mature enough to make a decision like choosing a major completely on their own with the thoughts of the next 20, 30 years of their life in mind, right? So everybody that I know who chose a good major. Oh, my wig fell off. So all the people that I know that chose a good major, almost every single one of those people chose their majors on the advice of their parents, right? On the advice of their counselors, on the advice of their mentors, on the advice of the environment that they grew up in. If you grew up, for example, upper middle class people tend to be white collar jobs. So you grew up in a place surrounded by a bunch of people with white collar jobs. A lot of them had degrees. And so you saw, I need to major in this, and this if I want to have the lifestyle that the people around me have, right? You grew up with those examples. You did not, through your own genius and wisdom, come up with the idea that you should be an accountant because you just love numbers and you just want a stable long-term job that's going to last you into the future. No teenager thinks like that. They do not. That is a thought process that a mature adult has, and they implant into your head. And I see so many people that want so badly for their station in life to be 100% them. And I am saying now, as a person who has had very little privilege in my life, that is 100% a fucking lie. And so it comes down to the question of, why then do people feel the need to justify their success in life as being 100% their own effort? And I'm not a sociologist and I'm not a psychologist. I'm just using my common sense in my own life experience. From my point of view, as a person who has struggled tremendously throughout life and who has overcome a lot of adversity, we as a culture, right, just in general, human beings love to hear a story of triumph. They love to hear a person who overcame adversity, who overcame the odds. They love to hear a rags to riches story. People love it, right? There is a certain amount of respect that is just reserved for people who overcame something, right? People love to hear stories of how I love to hear people tell me stories of how their great-grandfather came from XYZ country 100 years ago with a quarter in his pocket and he worked up to start this business and it's been in our family, blah, blah, blah years, right? We always hear stories like that, right? So we know as a society that people love it. They love to hear how you overcame something. They do. And everybody admires you in a way that a person who didn't have adversity will never be admired. And subconsciously, people know this. And because of that, a lot of people end up in situations where they didn't necessarily they didn't ask for a lack of adversity in their lives. So from my point of view, I think that people have this need to romanticize having had adversity in their lives. And I say romanticize because most people don't want to go through that struggle, right? They want the respect that having gone through the struggle would get them, but they don't want to have gone through that shit, right? They don't know what it feels like to not eat. They don't know what it feels like to not have basic utilities. They don't know what it feels like to be unclean because you can't wash yourself because the water is turned off. They don't know what it's like to grow up without any familial support. They don't know what it feels like to and when I say support, people always jump to like financial. I mean emotional, psychological support. If your parents were working class and they couldn't give you extra money, I want to ask you, were they there for you emotionally and did they support you and did you always have them to lean on, right? Imagine not having that, because I've never had that in my entire life. And I think that people will listen to this and they'll think, well, that doesn't seem likely that a person could grow up in such adverse circumstances. But that's just the way that I was raised, right? I don't know. I don't know what it's like to have familial support financially or emotionally. I don't know what it's like to live in a house on a quiet street and live in the same house for years, most of my childhood, and have neighbors and go on vacations and have like happy family gatherings and have like Christmases where you go downstairs and you open presents and your parents watch and record you open stuff and they got you the things that you really wanted. I don't know what any of those experiences are like. I've never had any of those experiences. And I think that people will kind of hear that and they'll think like, wow, that's just so really sad. And it's just like, you cannot miss to some degree what you never had, right? You can long for it, but I've never had it. I've never experienced it. But I can intellectually know that people who had all of these things, that sets you up to be a successful person in general, right? And so as a person who has struggled through life and I spend some time talking to other people who have struggled like I have, right? Who can relate to the life that I lived. Like, y'all are not about this fucking life. Y'all not about it. Y'all really not about this life. And so for me personally, I hate that people who have had, in my experience, the less adversity a person has suffered, the more that they will try to dig up the adversity in their life, right? I believe that I saw like a study that was done on this. I think it was Harvard students or Stanford students, right? If you go to Stanford or Harvard, there's a 99.9% chance that you came from a privileged background, right? We can stop talking about the stories of this one person who came from the hood, who worked hard to get into XYZ school. We can stop. 99.9% of them come from very privileged backgrounds. We know that. And the study, I remember reading it, and it said something like, when faced with any kind of rhetoric pointing out the privileges that the students faced, they all tried to grasp or look for adversities that they also had to overcome, right? And they didn't have that many. I'm not saying that people who grow up in a certain social class have the perfect life, but we as human beings severely downplay what having your basic needs met consistently for most of your childhood does to you psychologically. I think that people, to some end, I think that they resent it. And I think that they dislike that their work ethic is 100% not the reason why they are what they are. And for me, as a person who has just been through a lot in general, I find that pathetic. Like, even though I've gone through a lot, I was the first person in my family to go to college. And the reason I was able to go to college is because I got lucky and I was born in a first world country that had the social systems in place to allow for me to receive stuff like student loans. And I received a lot of student grants just for being poor. And I received all of these different types of support that allowed me to get my first college degree, right? A person raised like me in a third world country cannot do any of that, right? Even though I was raised in the hood and in poverty, below the poverty line my entire life, I was able to access medical services, right? Most of my molars have cavities in it from my childhood, just due to neglect from my parents. But I still have teeth because the United States allowed for me to access social services provided by the government. You understand? Even though we were homeless at times or evicted at times or didn't have food at times and didn't have this or that at times, I never starved to death, right? Because I was born in the United States, and the United States allows for me to access all of these social services that can provide you with food and clothes and shelter, etc., to allow me to survive to adulthood when I could take care of myself. These are all luck, and they are all privileges. And even though I don't have a lot of these other privileges that a lot of people listening to this video did have, I can admit that those privileges that I did have played a big role in me being where I am today. Like, that doesn't feel difficult for me. I don't need to pretend like, you know what, I worked just so hard to pay for college and I had a job the entire time. No, I did have a job and I did work hard to pay for college and to sustain my lifestyle in college, but the government contributed greatly to that. And that allowed me to graduate with a degree. And that degree allowed me to move overseas and get a job and to work that job, right? Those are all privileges. Maybe I don't have this many privileges, but guess what? This many is still a privilege. And it's always seemed so pathetic to me that people who had all of their bare necessities met, who had all of their emotional needs met, and then some, right? People who had all of these things seem, from my point of view and in my experience, to struggle the most with admitting that these are the reasons why you are where you are, right? Guess what? If you were born 100 meters from the finish line, you objectively did not have to walk as far as a person born 1,000 meters from the finish line. And this is not because you did something wrong. Right? We all of us, we cannot choose where we come from. We cannot choose how we were born, where we were born, who our parents were, how much money they had, what kind of people they were. We cannot choose it. That is completely and utterly luck, right? To some degree, and it's fate to some degree. But you have to admit that being born into advantageous circumstances contributes greatly to the reason why you are where you are in life. Because I want you to imagine your life if you didn't have any of those things. I want you to imagine your life, right? Go through your memories and start taking them completely away. And imagine how you could be where you are if you didn't have any of those things. How would you have survived up until this point without any of your family's support? I'm not saying just financially either. I'm saying emotionally. How would you have survived if you didn't have anybody to talk to? If you didn't have anybody to look out for you? If you didn't have anybody who loved you, how would you have survived? If you didn't have all of the advice and mentorship of older successful adults in your life, how would you have made the decisions that you have made? Like, how did you get all of this magical wisdom? What book did you read to get all of this wisdom on how to be a successful adult if you didn't learn it from your parents? Right? I want y'all to imagine that. Imagine what it feels like to not have anybody to call for money, or not have anybody to call when you need somebody to talk to, or to not have anybody to give you a ride, or anybody to pick you up, or somebody to let you live with them when you don't have anywhere else to go. Imagine not having a stable home. Imagine what it feels like to regularly not have food in the refrigerator. Imagine what it feels like to not have electricity or gas, or even in the modern age, internet. Imagine what all of that feels like. Imagine your entire life if all of that wasn't provided consistently for your entire childhood. Imagine that. Like, what would you have become? What would you have become? When I left the hood, right? When I left the hood, I remember when I was younger, I had this idea like, well, people in the hood, if they want, they could get out because I got out. But another privilege that I have is that I am somebody who is not easily influenced by the environment that I am in. And guess what? I never had to resist the influence of the environment I was raised in. I naturally have the predisposition to not be influenced. When people look at kids raised in the hood and they say stuff like, well, those people should just behave better or do right or follow the social rules, right? They should have this cultural or social capital that you had to learn. And they should be able to get themselves out of that situation. But we forget that human beings, for a large part, respond to their environment and they become what they were raised to become, right? Almost all the middle class people that I know my age, they were all raised middle class, right? All the upper class people that I know my age were all raised upper class, right? Working class people generally were raised working class, right? But this idea that people in the lower classes need to overcome their classes when you couldn't, right? That doesn't make sense to me personally through my own life experience. But as I've grown older, I realized that me having my personality and my just mental capabilities is a reason why I was able to get out of the place that I came from. And I didn't become a single mother. You know, I've never been on welfare in my entire adulthood, right? I've never done drugs in my entire life, even though I was raised around in my entire life, right? But on the other hand, my older sister, who is a lot more prone to influence, she became exactly what her environment made her, right? She dropped out of high school. I remember, I think she was like 16 when she finally quit. She's on welfare. She has a kid by a drug dealer, right? She doesn't really do anything with her life. She spends all day smoking weed, right? She became what her environment showed her to become. And she became all of those things because she is a person who is influenced, easily influenced. And when I say influence, I mean not negative influences, positive ones as well. Because if we look at society in general, most people follow trends, right? As a teenager, most of the people listen to this video, y'all all follow trends. I didn't follow any trend when I was a teenager, and I don't even as an adult right now, right? I mostly do what I want to do. And not because I'm different than other people and I'm better than other people. It's just not my predisposition to follow trends, whether it's positive or negative ones, right? Because it's not who I am. And that is a privilege in my opinion. It's very lucky in my opinion that I got the personality and disposition that I got, and that allowed for me to think, this is just not for me. I have no inclination to participate in this. I'm going to go off and go to college and do this with my life. And that is how I escaped the hood. Not because I worked so hard and I just resisted the gangs and the drugs and it was just so hard. No, it wasn't hard for me because I am me. And I don't understand why it is so difficult for so many grown ass adults, right? Because at this age, millennials are all 26, I believe, to 42, to admit that where you come from plays a large fucking role in the trajectory and outcome of your life. Yes, there are people who beat the odds, but the majority of people don't, right? If you were raised working class, you are more likely fucking working class or lower middle class or middle class, right? If you were raised middle class, you are more than likely lower middle class or middle class, right? Right? And if you were raised upper class, you were more than likely upper class. And having access to all of the connections and things that being raised in certain classes provided to you allowed you to become that class. So then why then do you turn around and say that you made the choices that you made as a young adult, right, from ages 18 to 25, because you are just more wise and have more wisdom than everybody else? It's always been strange to me how psychologically weak people who are privileged are. That is a psychological weakness, in my opinion. You have not had to go through much, but the sheer fact that you have to face the reality that you don't have that much adversity for a lot of people is psychologically traumatizing. And I find that so abso-fucking-lutely pathetic. Pathetic. Because being the type of person that I am, I find it so easy to be like, yeah, that person had, a hard life. And I feel like people will hear that and they'll say, well, Cosmic Nebula, you can't compare different types of struggle because what you struggle with and what I struggled with, you don't know my pain. And it's just like, that's bullshit. And you know it. We all know that paper cut and a knife wound are not the same degree of injury. We know that, right? A first degree burn and a third degree burn are not the same degree of injury. We know that, right? We can parse these severity levels, right? Being born poor in America is not the same degree of poverty as being born poor in some third world country that has none of the infrastructure that the United States has. And I'm not saying that it makes your life perfect, but I'm saying is that there are degrees to things, and you know there are. So I've never heard, this is anecdotal, I've never heard a person who grew up in some kind of extremely adverse situation deny other people the acknowledgement that they struggled as well, right? I've never seen that when it comes to people who struggled. But what I have seen is that a lot of people who haven't had much adversity in their lives, they are the ones who are the least empathetic to people who have. And I don't understand why that is. But I think that it's a goddamn shame. And I think that it is something that people really need to get over. A large part of your life is not just your own fucking doing. And you need to get that through your head. So your resentment, for a lot of people, your resentment of your privilege or your lack of struggle, it will not override the fact that you haven't had much struggle. Like, I don't understand why so many fully grown adults just lack the grace and empathy to extend acknowledgement to other people. And the reality is that nobody wants to be a person who grew up in a regular family with a regular family structure, on a regular street, who went to a regular school, who had regular familial support, whether it be financial or emotional. Nobody wants to have that kind of just run-of-the-mill, fairly quiet, fairly stable kind of life. But the reality is that in the majority of developed first world countries, a large part of the population was raised like that. And so, if you are someone who grew up in a stable, normal, regular family in a developed country, odds are that you have not faced that much adversity. That has led you to be able to become a stable, healthy, hardworking, contributing, successful member of society. And no amount of denying that and attributing it to yourself will take away from the fact that the circumstances in which you were raised are the biggest contributors to your own success. This has been a Cosmic Nebula video, and I will see y'all in the next one.